Thanks. It's great to be here. Before I start, is anyone watching Silicon Valley this season? Anybody? Like, I'm having this moment where I'm big head, and I'm like, wait, I'm the one talking. So don't worry, I'm not showing a movie. But if you do have questions while I'm talking, that's great. Like, lecturing seems very much not who I am. So if you want to ask while we go through the presentation, that would be awesome. So as you heard my entire bio, and I sound really old, I really love storytelling. Right now I have a firm called SutherlandGold. We do creative communications and work with companies like Zendesk and SurveyMonkey, and work with a lot of startups to help them figure out story. And usually when they come to us, they've either just putting together fundraising decks or have gone through trying to find a Series A, and they come to us with this deck and they think that's their story, and we basically have to undo everything they've done. So if that's you, you're so lucky you're here, and those other people, the other sessions are missing out. So before I start my backstory, and this is something that's really critical, I think, in storytelling, not just who you are today, but how did you get here? And so a little bit about my backstory. That's me when I was 9. And what I wanted to be was a philosopher, because I thought, like, you got to tell people what to do, you lived outside, you were always right. It seemed like the perfect thing for me. I then realized it wasn't that lucrative and had really bad outfits. And so the next thing I thought of was I'll be a writer, also not super lucrative. And so I'm going to tell you the story about kind of how I became an accidental marketer. And as you heard from my illustrious career highlights, I worked at the Democratic National Committee, and I was in this department of the radio services. And at the time, radio was just becoming a big communications medium, or again. And so my job was actually to support crime legislation they were hoping to pass on the Hill. And I had to go to senators and congresspeople and have them record these really boring sound bites that then I would go into. This sort of looked like my office, like really outdated radio equipment at 5 a.m. and like send it out to every Democratic radio host in the country who used absolutely none of it because it was garbage. And at the same time, like while I was doing that, like this is like every day I heard like, look what he's doing. And this is Rush Limbaugh, because I realized from young people in my office are like, who is that? So Rush Limbaugh, this was in the early 90s, was just sort of picking up steam, which is interesting for political scientists today to see how far that's come. But what he was doing was he was telling these like really compelling stories, like whether they were true or not. There were heroes, there were villains, there were murderers. I mean, it was like a whole kind of worldview being espoused in this talk radio. And meanwhile, I had my canned sound bites. So one day I came into my office, and if you've worked in politics, depending on how fundraising cycles go, you might come in one day and actually no one works there anymore because they've all been let go because there's no money. And so I was the unpaid intern, so I walked in and everyone had been let go. And I realized after about a week that no one was going to come down and check on me because the office, I think people thought the equipment was like a biohazard or something. And so I thought, if no one's going to tell me what to do, I can really do anything. And I really hate these canned sound bites. And what would make this issue more compelling to me? And the big idea I had was I really loved and had done a lot of work with kids. And I said, what if I found kids in these areas that are being impacted by this legislation and by the crime statistics in these neighborhoods? And I went to local boys and girls clubs and found, about 15, 20 kids that I interviewed and curated their stories, and basically put together a panel of kids that I started, pitching to radio hosts around the country. And lo and behold, their stories not only got picked up, but it actually changed the way we talked about the issue. So before I was sort of telling these hosts that, crime is so terrible, we should be outraged. And what made these kids' stories so compelling was like the apathy. And so like rather than having this kind of moment of like, we should all be outraged, to hear these kids and to hear them be like, that's just my life, was more than anything I could ever do. And what also happened is these sound bites and statistics I was gathering, these radio hosts were like, can you give me that stat? I want to use it. And so they literally picked up all this messaging that I gathered and attached it to these like wonderful, compelling stories. And so that was really my aha moment, that like, I don't want to be the person just crafting the sound bite. I don't want to be the person just saying the chest beating message of the agenda. I want to find these stories and tell them. And that led me to a career in marketing, which, I sort of say, I'm conflicted about it. We can talk about that later. But anyway, I do like working with companies to help them figure out what are the stories that they want to tell and what are the issues they can represent to various constituencies. And so today, I think storytelling has become somewhat of a buzzword, especially in Silicon Valley. Like, oh yes, we need to have a great story. We love storytelling. We want to create a storytelling culture. If everyone could do it, we would. It's actually hard. And so I'm going to kind of walk you through our process, which is, I think, different than a lot of kind of branding exercises or story exercises that at least our clients have encountered before. So bear with me, and again, if you have questions, ask, because they lean to the very right brain creative in all of us. But the first starting point that I like to tell people is nothing kills a story like vanity. And you usually when you start a kind of branding exercise or a story exercise, there's a moment where like, let's look in the mirror and look at ourselves really hard and see what's there and put it on paper. And you spend hours doing that and you're like, we're so much better than everybody else. Like if we had a Gartner quadrant, we'd like kick ass on that side. And you get a brand lens and it's, again, like total self-actualization of the company and everyone feels awesome. And then you kind of make some brand positioning and you think like, wow, we're there, we've arrived. And I don't want to belittle these because these are important corporate assets. They're just not a story. And so, put those to the side. If you must do them, you must have them. And I'm sure, again, if you've done a fundraising round, you have something that looks like this or a stand-in like this. But brand does not create the story. The story really creates the brand, and great brands know that. So I'm going to pull back and again ask for kind of suspension of disbelief, or like, why did we come to this, as I walk through the creative pieces of how you generate a story. So the first thing, and I had to pull a Wonder Woman clip to update this just because I feel like this is a we-arrived moment for women. But every story, and if you think back to the first stories you've read and loved, they start with setting. That you're in Narnia, you're in Alice in Wonderland. There's a really distinct world that you're in. And so before you look at yourselves, look at the world. And you have an opportunity to choose pieces of it, because what you're really doing is you need to find out, what are the rules of this world? And this is actually an exercise, so if you guys want to write it down, like what are the rules? What are the laws? Who are the good guys? Who are the bad guys? I mean, these are the things you have to identify, because you are not an island unto yourself. And so this is the canvas that you're in, and this is a great opportunity to really define that world. The next exercise, which is a little bit more camp counselor in me, which I actually was camp counselor, and I thought they were going to read that in my bio, so I'll stick that in now. But it is sort of that mood board kind of, what is the feeling? And a lot of companies, if you're looking at visual brand, if you're looking at tone and voice, doing something like this, whether it is on Pinterest or old-fashioned way, like sometimes getting glue and scissors, kind of is a nice way, to feel like you're assembling story, really gives you an idea of okay, our world works like this. These are the rules. These are the laws. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. And here's what it feels like. And this is a piece too that often people are like, I don't really care. But then it's hard to figure out what you stand for if there's not some tone and voice to what you're doing. So that's a little bit unsettling. Okay, so this is the part people like. So now it's back to us. We know the world around us, and we're a character in this world. If you've done branding, if you've talked to different people, one of the things we like to tell people to do is think of your brand as a person. How would you describe them? If there's some people who are creative in this room, you might get really deep and write a little vignette, walks to the store, this is the kind of coffee he or she likes, this is, and you can get really deep, or you can just do adjectives. It really doesn't matter, but what you're going for is a sense of kind of personal quirks or things that make you stand out that you might not get to if you're just this is why I'm awesome. And then it's sort of looking at the landscape now, you have your setting, there are various characters in the setting, and there are heroes and there are villains, there are mentors. This is kind of standard storytelling. And I think people, when they're trying to look for their character of their company, again, are looking for differentiation. That's a buzzword people hear. And really great characters are about connection. And there needs to be pieces that are familiar and accessible to people. So finding out that genre of, where you kind of sit in this world. And when I say villain, I would say a Larry Ellison in the day could be a good villain. You can have that as a persona. Obviously, right now, with things going on at Uber, it's probably not a popular persona. But I think there are things that you can inhabit that might be true to who you want to be. The exercise we do here is, again, once you've kind of looked at who the person is that you want the company to sort of feel like and personify, we look at archetypes. Who is the sort of hero or villain or mentor that you represent most like a jester, or a classical hero, or an outlaw. So again, we're looking for things that people will find familiar, because why stories are so powerful is that there's not new stuff thrown at you. There's a familiar format that you can digest, and you're like, oh, I understand. I know that person. They're familiar to me. And so looking for those kinds of pieces, and this is something as a company, whether you have 6, 8, 10 people in a meeting kind of looking at this, usually I would say everyone around the table chooses some different attributes. And what we'd like to do in this sort of circle is talk about what appealed to you and why, and how are you interpreting those. And it usually leads to really fruitful discussion about kind of really what is the true character of the company and what's going to appeal most to your key constituencies. So we have the sort of setting, we have the characters, then we have the worldview. And for people who've gone through this could be viewed as more of a mission or a purpose, but really it's that, how is this character going to interact with this world that they're in? And again, this should feel somewhat familiar to you. If you're thinking about the stories this really is how all stories go. We're introduced to a world, we understand how it works, we meet the people, he or she has something unique or awesome or something they're striving for that they're going to bring back. So what is that? How do you articulate it? And this is just a good way to sort of look at those two worlds merging together. There is a little bit of tension in kind of the worldview piece, just because in every story, as you guys know, there is some sort of conflict that needs to be resolved. And so again, as you're thinking through a narrative, what is that conflict in your story? So the way we begin to address worldview, and again, this is sort of exercises I've put together in this deck that probably take a series of at least 2 to 3 kind of workshops with your team. But I have this up here because, again, my kids who always get annoyed that I'm like making them do creative stuff when they just want to play video games or code or do whatever they do. I pulled out this one, and I don't know if people recognize her. She's a spoken word poet on YouTube. And so, again, like my kids are like, you're so uncool. But what I know. I'm sure you guys are thinking the same. You can compare notes later. So Sarah Kay is a spoken word poet. And what she says when people say they're not creative is that everyone's creative, and all you really have to do is make a list. And her list that she suggests people make, and we've adopted this list because it is actually really awesome, is what are 10 things that you know to be true? And so what we'll do is we'll sit down with the exec team at a company, everyone will go off and make their list, and there are 10 things I know to be true, or things they know intrinsically just from their own experience. So for example, we had one company that says, the lights of the company never go out before 10. So it wasn't about the product, but it was about sort of the work ethic. We had another one that said, our team is closer than any other team. So you look for things that are much more kind of value-oriented and about your experience working in the company, working on the product. And then what you do is you look around and everyone reads their lists and people say, oh, I had that one too. Or I had one like that. And again, it sort of sparks a discussion. And there's a theme here, which is getting everybody out of this sort of thinking of, why are we better? What problem do we solve? What benefits do we bring? And really beginning to be like, let's dig a little deeper and what are we all about? And so it's a super easy exercise that I think if you're looking for a discussion to be had among key stakeholders of your team, I would definitely recommend doing. And part of the reason we get to that exercise is we like to say as we're looking at that worldview, there's usually like a one-word trigger. And I have a couple brands up here and how they use sort of their one-word truth, as we say, or that one-word trigger. And for Patagonia, it's truth. And really, their truth is truth, which is somewhat confusing. But if you see, like the truth is you choose a universal value. But the way they use truth is they say, we know our brand is for people who love outdoors and love the environment. But the truth is, like every time we climb a mountain or scale it, we do some sort of incremental harm. And so we have to be thoughtful about what we do in the environment at all times, if we love it. So that's like kind of a cool narrative that kind of gets triggered as soon as you hear the word truth. One that's more accessible, Airbnb, belonging. I know probably people remember when they introduced Bello and went through the belonging kind of campaign. But if you think about it, that's a great story for all of their users. Like whenever I travel, I want to feel like I belong. And so that becomes a great narrative for them to sort of land their story. So that's a little bit of kind of walking through setting and character. And sort of, yes, a question. That's great.
So are you saying about the trigger, is that the brand or the company, but that brand, you would like to be able to equate a word with that brand? Is that what you're?
Yeah, and this is one of those things too that when we do this, people are like, "Can I have 2 words?" And so the word is really
One.
Well, you want one because it kind of creates, and we'll go through more of this. Like one word just creates clarity of like vision. And I think when you hear a lot about vision, and usually like the more words you start using, the worse it gets. I mean, I'm sure you've all noticed that. And one word just kind of like, hey, when you think about a story, and I'm telling you about, hey, I wrote a great story. It's all about truth. And so like that's what you're looking at. Like you don't start reciting the plot. Like this story resonated with me because it was about, political infighting. It was, so there's something that is the end of that sentence that needs to get to. And so that's the way I look at it. And I've tried it where you could just say fill in the blank at that last sentence. But again, you sort of get people, it's really hard to pull very smart technical people out of feeling like they have to be smart all the time. And so the exercises here, let's not worry about what the right answer is or what the smart answer is, but what would actually really make us a story that is unique and believable and really resonate with people. And I always say people, and this is a question I haven't gotten from you yet, but I get a lot is like there's a lot of consumer brands, like how does this work with enterprise companies or B2B? And I use people and consumers really to mean anyone's customer, and it works equally as well. So was that?
No, that's great.
That's good.
That was actually my follow-up question, which is this more consumer versus business oriented, but customer?
I think, and I'm biased. Like I think there needs to be something that actually is. Very few people can build a great story that's so super focused on just a technical audience. And again, if it is, it's just a more narrowly focused story. So it's not kind of a universal story. It's more of an audience-specific story. Any other questions? I love questions. No. Okay. So the favorite part of everyone's story, and especially if you were little, you remember there's always a moral to the story. And before you really dive into like what are the actions in my story, what drives my story, we like to say you've done all this work now to figure out your worldview, what the truth is that your story kind of leans on. Figure out at least kind of what could the moral be, because you really have all the pieces. And the reason why you do this, and I steal this from Pixar because they're obviously great storytellers, is that the more you know how your story ends, the more clarity you can have through all the different pieces of your story. And so kind of looking at, again, your character and kind of what they feel like is important, you should be able to at least have a sort of placeholder, kind of the moral of our story is. Now we get to plot. And this is one of those things where, to me, when people talk about story, very few people, and I just mentioned, will go to you and say, here's everything that happened in a story. But yet when you're talking to story or about story, people get really focused on the plot. And that's why we wait till the very end to do it. We look at all the different pieces that we feel like make a story really rich and powerful. And then we're like, okay, well, how would we begin to tell it? Because really that's what plot is. It's a device to move your characters through this world that you've created to find the things that are lacking and bring them to ultimately your customers. And this is kind of the classic hero's journey. And I was, an English major type person. So I'm like, oh, everyone's seen this. But it really is like stories, just the way they have familiar characters and familiar patterns. Like every story is kind of the same. It's always sort of this journey that a character embarks on to find something that's missing and then they bring it back. And so you have all these pieces that you've spent time with your team identifying. And so really all you have to do is sort of land them on this journey, and you're kind of close to figuring out kind of what this story might look like. To help people actually begin to say, like, what could this plot be? I've pulled from another great storyteller. You guys probably know this, is that, he was famous for saying that I could tell a story in 6 words. And so this is a 6-word story. There's a storyteller in residence at Sequoia named James Buckhouse, and he said, you can tell a 4-word story. And so basically one of the exercises in terms of figuring out plot is, what would a 4-word story be? A question I always get, do you mean a tagline? It could be a tagline, but really like, what is something that if people heard it, it would explain what you did? Really quickly, really concisely, and usually you can get anywhere from 20 to 60 forward stories that as a team you can look at and sort of say, that feels good, that feels right. But it begins to give you a sense of, where you are, who you are, what you're about, and where you're going. Sorry, that would be the exercise piece, what's your forward story. And this is what it begins to look like. When you get all of these pieces kind of in place, you want to actually take time and arc them out. And This is the classical hero's journey. Like if you went and looked online, you would see this illustrated in many different ways. But you can see on the very left, like you're starting out, and that's where you put your setting piece. And that really is like, here's what the world looks like today. And this is your chance, if you were telling your story, to give your view of the entire landscape as you see it. And this is probably like, you can't start the story until you have that. And that is going to tell every audience you reach kind of where they are and how you think. Then you kind of have that urgency piece, which is why, like, why does this character feel so compelled to move so quickly into action? What is happening that is spurring, Jack and Jill up that hill? Then they get to the top of the hill and they're like, oh, I found it. I found that truth, that we were seeking. And this is where you can put that truth piece in. And it really meant something. And typically, like if you were arcing out your story, this would be the kind of that value statement of what you bring. Like, what are you bringing into this world? And then this is probably not the best visual because it shows a somewhat negative aspect of, your success and Jack and Jill falling down the hill. But usually once you've done something in this world or as a company, there's some kind of impact. And so you need a short bullet there that captures what was that impact. And again, the impact goes directly to like, what did the world look like? What was missing? What were the characters like? And so you begin to see like, there was this urgent moment to climb, to find something. We found it, it had this impact. And at the end, you see that Jack has his moral of the story, I'll never give up. So that after all of this kind of action and activity, exploration, there was a moral to like why I was told this tale by this company. And when I talk about this narrative and people, when we do this, this is really something that you have this narrative, so it's playing inside your customer's head when they hear the name of your company. Like this is sort of who you're about. This is how they know you. It's not necessarily what you say every single day to every single customer or reporter or audience you speak to, but it really is the kind of like, if you were to distill what we were all about, this is it. So sort of at the end of all of this, like when you're thinking of story, and I kind of go back to some of the things at the beginning, it really is a right brain exercise. So you need to start with thinking like, what do we want people to think? What do we want people to feel? And what do we actually want them to do? And I would say our stories, we work with any kind of client, is what's the action we want to inspire? So what about the story is so moving that they're not just going to remember it and feel it, maybe retell it, but they're actually going to do some action, whether it's purchase, evangelize, whatever it might be. And I will say in this era of social, having stories that are really simple and have familiar patterns are the ones that get passed along, like those campfire stories. They're easy to tell people, like, you'll like this because it is about truth. You'll like this because, it has a real moral, like it speaks to me because I know that belonging anywhere I travel is super important. Oops, sorry. I'm trigger happy with the clicker. And this is the checklist at the end of the day. So you've sort of sat down with your team, you've gone through various sessions together, you've identified the pieces, you've worked with somebody, maybe like me, who's saying, here's how we're gonna weave all these pieces together to get to your story. These are the things we look to like as being critical to success. Do they expose a higher truth? Did your story do that? Did you create a unique worldview? Did you make people feel? Did you spark discussion? And this is one I think people have a hard time with because they feel like, again, for so long you looked at kind of positioning your company, even when you were looking in the funding round, as being like, we are absolute. And we're sort of speaking in a diatribe as opposed to a dialogue. And so really being able to say, these are the kinds of discussions and issues we're willing and want people in whatever community we're in to talk about. And lastly, do they inspire action? So that's sort of the checklist to story that we look at. And once we have this story, it becomes, as I said, it's definitely something you tell internally. It becomes the internal narrative you want your customers to remember, and it begins to inform all those pieces of collateral that you're going to generate. And so instead of having super boring ass positioning statements, you actually have something that might sound original or colorful, that is a little bold. And so that's what we're going for when we do all of this. So my last thing, and I'm the fastest talker ever, so I have so many questions that I can take from all of you. And if you don't have any, we can actually go and do some of these exercises. But do take risks, be creative, and this is, as I said, I think teams often have a hard time feeling like they can be creative. And then don't be afraid to iterate. It really is a process of kind of looking at what you've written and how you can edit it and make it sort of your own. So that's my lessons in storytelling. If people have questions, ask them. If not, I'm happy to sort of if you guys have pen and paper computers, we can do a couple of the exercises, which is always fun and exciting. But questions?
Well, I'll go again.
Oh, good, my best student.
I'm at the front.
Yeah, of course.
So from the time that the founder or founders think about they want to do something to hiring people to having product out in the market, where do you feel like you have the best chance to impact positively that timeline? At like after they've got product in the market, before, I mean, kind of when do you like to get involved?
So it's a great question, and it's somewhat different answers depending on the product that companies have. I met with a really young company yesterday, and I was talking to them, and there's sort of a very large version of storytelling that you can do to sort of inform all of your brand assets and everything you're going to do for the next 3 years. And there's a truncated version because what they were struggling with is they were a seed-funded company who was looking to get a Series A in the fall and need to have some public-facing news event happen in late summer. And so they sort of like, how do we begin to think about our story? And I think that's a pretty common, place for a lot of young companies. And so what I said to them is, you need a story for now. Like, you don't necessarily need your story forever, but there's certain pieces here. Like, I don't think you can do anything public-facing without actually knowing how you view the world, who you are in that world, and what you're bringing to it. And those are the pieces. And I was saying to them, I think that gets you probably 18 months to 2 years that you can use it. Given how they were 7 people, so they were a 7-person team. Like, are you going to spend a lot of money right now creating brand assets? And probably not. So, as I said, I think there's certain, what I try to do is look at where companies are in their life cycle and where they're going to be in a few years to figure out how much of, this do you need. But and I'm biased, obviously, because I think I'm one of those people, I think every company's like bottled water to me. Like, that's what I always say. It's like they're all sort of the same. It's kind of the story that makes them different. I mean, there are a few companies, and they're always the ones people talk about, like, oh, we want to be just like Apple, and and we want to be a product-driven company because they have awesome products, and they do. But it's like saying I want to make a gold, a solid gold album. I want to have a video go viral. Like, it's really hard to say, like, that's all I'm going to have. And so I sort of come from this perspective of, what if everyone's starting at neutral? Like, what do you do then? Like, what defines you? So that was a very long answer, but I think you need some sort of at least glue of a story to get out there publicly.
So this is for developing a story of kind of your company, your business. How would you see this process change for a specific product or feature, kind of like response?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So we had a client where we did the whole sort of company narrative, and they were an older company or had been around for maybe 4 or 5 years, pretty successful. I would say, pre-IPO, 18 months kind of thing. And they loved what we did for their overall brand, and they actually had a specific line of business that they were like, can you help us there? And so the process was different. And I would say, and this goes a little bit to when we were talking about sort of B2B or audience-specific stories. And so a lot of what we did, like the stakeholder, or the people participating in the workshops at the corporate, or the company level, are usually all like the C-suite, like the people you would expect. And so I think the key thing for doing something that was very product-specific, and this obviously may seem obvious because there's a reason it's called product marketing, but who are the people on the team closest to the product? Who are the people on the team closest to the people buying the product? It was interesting because in doing that, kind of workshop with that team, the people who were most insightful were their customers. And again, like, that's always hard to tell a young company because sometimes you don't have customers. So that was a luxury. But you could always find a stand-in for a prototype customer. So you have to have some idea of who that person is. But it was interesting because, again, when you walk through sort of different questions and creative exercises with people buying or prospective buyers, they answer differently. They're not thinking like, oh, here's my checklist, And it was interesting. I was doing this project for a company similar, kind of going into a new space, and they had me talk to and do some of these exercises with one of their buyers who's going to resell the product. And they were all about, like, we're all about AI and machine learning. Like, that is, like, there are so many customers right now, like, that's a checklist item. Like, I literally had to prompt the person at the end, be like, so do you care about AI or machine learning? Oh yeah, like, that's totally important, but like, my customers just need to be happy. like that, like what he or she was focused on was like the total end user. And that's another thing I think, especially B2B companies fall that trap where they forget the end user because like that's not who I'm selling to. But sometimes there is like an end user experience that needs to be told because like somebody cares about that. So I just thought that was interesting. So for you AI machine learning people, just, it is very buzzy. Reporters love it. Just know when you're talking to people in the real world, they want to know how it translates.
Actually, that was kind of a follow-up on that. I'm curious where you find most teams struggle and where they hit the pitfalls of trying to go through this process.
Oh, so that's super easy. Like the first one is like, we're not creative. We know what we want to say. We've done this before. Marketing people suck. It's a waste of money. And again, like my product speaks for itself. Like there's a lot of resistance. And again, I think, and I get it. Like it's really fuzzy. Like we live in this like very concrete, data-driven. And this is like, I'm talking about like, we need something that makes us feel, and it's kind of the, people are like, no, we don't. So I think there's like, something about it that makes people really uncomfortable. And also, I think you have to go into the mindset, we don't know the answers. And I think a lot of people who've excelled their whole lives hate saying that we don't know the answers. So I think that would be the first thing is like making sure that people participating on your team like have some sort of open mind to the actual activity because otherwise they just shouldn't be there because they can just rat hole forever. Don't worry, like I can handle those people. It is funny because it's just like that. So I think that's number one. I think consensus can sometimes be hard for teams and that, either there's everyone's thinking so much the same that it's kind of sad that like where is the diversity of thought? Or else the teams are all over the place and they can't get consensus and ultimately like how do you drive consensus among your team?
Are there any B2B companies that you think have really strong stories right now?
Well, I think that one I'm fascinated by as a storyteller, and it kind of reminds me if anyone's seen Jaws, how you never really see the shark and you just hear the music and you're like, oh my God, I'm so scared and like Jaws is terrible. I think Palantir has done a really good job of kind of creating like, I don't even know what their story is, but I'm scared. Like, and like I know they do scary shit. So like I think that's kind of,
well, they're listening to you right now.
Yeah, probably. No, but I think it's one of those like kind of myths of the valley where it's like, I don't know, they're really big and they're really successful. And so I think that that's a story, and that's sort of what I mean. Like, I mean, again, like, I don't know if any people here could say this is exactly what they do, but most people have heard of them, kind of know how to bucket them and would say, oh, they're really killing it. So that's one that kind of comes to mind. I'm also biased. I've worked on Zendesk for a long time, so I think they have a great story and kind of have made this sort of happiness and Buddha vibe kind of go a long ways throughout their story.
I'm thinking of ways to apply this from a brand down to specific products and telling that story. But the challenge I run into a lot is that people want it to be, this product to be everything to everybody, and it's really hard to focus on like what is the one thing that this is going to do that's going to be the best for this one type of customer. How do you think about that? Because especially in this technology world, it's like, oh, this is an all-in-one solution that addresses all these 10 different kinds of personas and their problems.
Yeah, so my background was in campaigns. So I worked in politics for a long time, and the thing you learn from campaigns is you have your base. So who is your base that you already have? And so for product people, you have your base. So there's some consumer or customer that you should have a really good profile of. And almost that exercise we did with the brand persona, like what is that personification of that buyer? And I don't mean like the Sally is a 25-year-old millennial. And like there's that kind of, like we've all seen that. I mean, I'm talking like more from a, like if they were real, not like this fake composite that, is sort of built to like the all-in-one solution that you have. So kind of that honesty of like, what would that person look like? And then I think, and there's definitely, this is sort of in that marketing world, it's just as important to know who you're willing to alienate as who you're willing to, appeal to. And so I think making those decisions like, right now, our base likes this. The next group that we can go after is this group. And this is how we get them, and it's, like Hillary Clinton's never gonna get a Trump voter, right? So there are certain people that you make certain choices based on how you wanna sell. And I think that's sort of part of your go-to-market strategy. But I think you have to be real about who this buyer is, not the fake composite, and then also be willing to say, these are people we don't care about right now. And that's really hard for companies because they're like, we'll take sales from anywhere. We're young, like anything's good. And I think that kind of muddies up who you are.
I'm curious, I'm hanging up on these 2, 4, and 6 word.
Oh yeah, they're fun.
So, yeah.
You'll never, once you start too, you'll be like in the shower, like, oh my God, I have another one. Yeah.
Who do you respect out there? Like, who does it
Really well.
Other examples, you have Patagonia, think different. Like, there are lots of things, but who do you really?
Well, I have Airbnb. Like, I thought the Airbnb, and I didn't work on it at all, so I can just I thought that was brilliant because I think it was very counterintuitive in terms of what their product was, which to me was about travelers and going places and having different type of travel experiences, and to talk about it more as this global community of belonging, to me was really genius. And I think the best things sort of take the obvious and sort of flip them on their head, because that's what's aspirational. Do you know what I mean? That was something hey, as a customer of Airbnb, I never thought about myself really caring about belonging, but I do, and I want to be part of the team. So it kind of brought something new to me. So that's one I love, and there's certainly ones that are catchy, but I don't. So, and I sort of I thought opt outside, if this was a campaign people remember, and I'm tending to consumer brands. I do think tech brands are not great at this because it is such a functional, there is no marketing involved because everyone hates marketing people, so no one wants to spend anything on marketing, and so you have sort of poor marketing. But if you remember opt outside, it was REI, it was their Black Friday campaign 2 years ago, and I thought again, if you want to be a brand that stands for something and your 2 words are opt outside, it was a really powerful kind of statement to make, and they put a lot of social behind it. And I thought that was just really cool to see.
I just had a quick question on the specific villain aspect of this. Is that really who you're positioning against? So if it's Airbnb, is it the hotel industry?
Yeah, and I think that. Well, I think that's a great question, and I think if you see narratives that get covered a lot, especially in media, and I say this having been sort of on the other side and working at CNN, there has to be a bad guy. I don't even really care about the good guy. There just has to be a bad guy, and the better the bad guy in the story, the more I want to cover that story. And it's a sad sort of commentary on news, but evil does sort of trump good in terms of getting coverage, and we see that every day. And so if you're trying to pick a villain, choose a big bad one. And you often, to me, that's more important than saying, we're the Uber of food, or we're, that's the other thing you see for companies do, we're the YouTube of books, or the Netflix of blah, blah, blah. And I think rather than sort of have we're so like this other great company you heard of, tell me a really compelling story of what's at stake if the villain wins. And TiVo, when we did TiVo, I would say half of TiVo was really about saying the TV industry is vile and awful, which was kind of a weird kind of story and hard to tell because from a business perspective for TiVo was challenging. But the media was yes, we love that. Throw the programmers out the window. We want really quality TV and we want to have control over our TV. So I think having a villain really puts you and actually helps define you in a way that you have a hard time doing yourself.
Yeah. Well, when you actually do your positioning or your forward thing, it shouldn't be negative.
For you, no, but I think there is when I say villain, and I think back to and this is an easily accessible story, but Apple and Steve Jobs and the pirate flag. I mean, pirates are kind of a villain and kind of challenging. This goes to the whole world at the time. Being the person who's poking your thumb at the establishment is sort of a villain personality, right? Because you're a pain in the ass and you don't follow any of the rules. So I think that's how true to that are you willing to be? And I think that's most people don't choose that, but I do think some people just say I'm going to do that because it's the way I make a mark. And even Mark Benioff, I think when you look at the trajectory of Salesforce, I would say he started and he was much more, and then I'm older than most people, but he was sort of a villain in the Valley, and he's kind of now resurrected and once you're successful, you're amazing, and and his persona has changed. So in some ways you could look at how do I get to a place where I need to be, and then I can sort of change who I actually am. And there's a lot of, I think, people like that, the older, kind of tech giants, where you can look at the trajectory and the arc, not just at their story, but actually who they were during the story.
Well, I think Salesforce used the villain story to lead their success. No software. They did.
Anyone else? You have 15 minutes. No? Do you guys want to do an actual exercise while you're here and you have 15 minutes of your time? I think what I would say, and we can do show of hands, I would suggest either the 10 things I know to be true, and these is a good exercise to do, or the forward stories. you want to have a vote? Who wants to do the 10 things I know to be true? All right, it looks like the forward stories might be the winner. I was never good at math, but that was an easy one. So just kind of as a guiding point, the forward story, and I will just say, if you have 5 words or 6 words, that's okay. If you want to have some that are more emotional, and this is like just kind of the benefit, and some that are functional, that's also really helpful. Cool. So you guys can start and do, and if you guys have questions, you can come while you're doing this, ask me. I think the forward story was spread customer happiness everywhere. For Facebook, I can tell you we've done this. So Facebook, we have one, and again, this isn't what they use, but we had one where we, hear from friends. Like that was how the forward story around Facebook. That we were again just sort of workshopping. Index all the world's information. That's kind of a famous one. So I think again, you can go something that's really kind of creative and abstract, where it's one word period, one word period, one word period, and it feels more like a tagline. Or you could do something that's just like very descriptive of how the service or product or company runs or works. Does a brave volunteer want to say what their company does and then read a couple of their forward stories? Oh, brave volunteer.
So should I not read the stories first?
Sure, do that. That was a fun game over there. Let's read the stories first and we can all guess.
Quickly improve user onboarding. One. Another one is easily build user guidance.
Mm-hmm.
Drive user action in app.
Yeah, no, these are good. But actually, the good news is you see how easy it actually is, and it's kind of, all right, keep going.
Data-driven user onboarding.
Uh-huh. I think he's done this exercise before, I'm just going to say.
And last one is better user onboarding, easy.
So I would say you're a company about easy user onboarding. That has some sort of app to use it, because there was an app.
Yeah, it's a way to build easy user onboarding inside of your application without writing code.
Good. So was that helpful? Have you done? Okay.
Yeah, never done this before.
Good. That's not, so. Who wants to go next? I know that was kind of like an A+, and I will say that as I am the professor of the class. So I'm sure there's many.
A couple of them include take community with you, connect, build, explore, find your tribe, democratizing where you are, connect and thrive here, imagine your own world, and world where you belong.
So I'd say consumer. Social, sounds like some sort of social gathering. I don't know if, so it's always, so I will say it's harder with consumer, even though there were all these consumer examples. But those, so anyone else have other guess about more specifically than what I had and about what they might do?
Like a community platform? Yeah, pretty good. We're a social and virtual reality platform, high fidelity.
Cool.
What's the name of the company?
High fidelity.
No. And also a great book.
Yeah.
Who's next?
I think I cheated because I used a greater than sign in there too.
Oh, that's okay. Symbols get you away from words. Well played.
Fueling movements, missionaries greater than sign mercenaries.
Okay. I feel like we entered like Dungeons and Dragons. But it's highly, it's very evocative. Like the world part is like going strong on that one. Keep going. Is there more?
I don't like the other ones.
Okay, now we all have to know. So what does the company do?
So,
I can't even hazard to guess. But does someone else want to guess? Because
Can I add to it?
We work in the same company.
People can guess. Empowering today's boldest founders. Built by founders for founders. Unleashing the creative entrepreneur.
So
I can add one.
We're a team.
you are a team.
Panit?
I had one.
Oh, you guys are all a team?
Yeah.
You guys like each other a lot, huh? Like you spread out as far as you could be. Like
Bringing empathy to investing. Highest EQ in the valley. In valley.
Bill?
So I had funding future leading companies today. That's too much. That didn't sound nearly as good as what I thought it was. had such promise in my mind. God, I couldn't even say it without tripping over myself.
Well, this will be fun though, because if you mold all these together. So it sounds like a, well, actually, who wants to guess? I have a guess, but I mean, I don't, I've talked a lot, so does anyone else want to guess? No? I mean, it sounds like some sort of elite Kickstarter-y type thing.
Oh my God! Micro VC. Oh shit, no.
What was that?
No, sorry. So all of us we're true ventures. So,
Oh.
the venture
Wow.
Venture capital.
Yeah, venture capital.
I've heard of them.
Yeah. Now yeah.
Well, I'm available later if you guys need extra help.
Pass fail though, right?
Yeah. Anyone else? We have a few more minutes. No?
We did it as a team.
Yeah, that's okay.
We sat next to each other.
But you're not the same company, but
Oh, no, we are.
okay.
Hire better from within. Hire from your people. Build your dream team. Or referrals build dream teams. I like the first two.
Mm-hmm.
Those were his. Come on.
So who wants to? I mean,
They were teamable.
teamable.
Yeah.
Oh, so that's the company, and they do. I mean, I was.
Yeah, we're an employee referrals product. So we help you source top talent that you already know.
That you already know. That's interesting. That's a twist.
The best way to
Oh. All right, anyone else? No? Any other questions? Because I will give you your time back, because that's also the kind of person I am, because I'm sure you've been, you'll get to lunch before the other people, and then, like, she was the best. Oh.
So our company's all very stealthy. So I've noticed myself trying to explain what we do without saying what we do over and over again in the past 2 days. So do you have tips for like forming a story that's still supposed to be a little bit mystical and unknown?
Well, as I said, I think Palantir, which is very public, is still mystical and unknown. So I think it's possible. I always think, stealthy companies, it's hard to think of like what you're going to say that's going to kill your story. But usually you could have that, what we're all about, and you could have like that very broad statement of like, we're about truth because we're bringing that to all of our customers. And we do that through, whatever you do it through. But I think in this day and age, young companies, like there's less value in this there's no such thing as a big launch anymore where you just come out and like here's your big party, because no one really covers it in that way. So I think you're probably better off thinking of like, what can I say to get people excited and intrigued versus being so worried about, did I say too much? And usually saying too much is a problem like public companies have. It's not a huge problem for very young companies that are just starting, because usually you don't have like 6 announcements in the pipeline, right? Like you're not going to give away your product roadmap. So I think just looking at something that is like very clean is like probably the emotional benefit sentence with something that actually ties it to reality. So there needs to be something, a little bit of what you do, and I just wouldn't worry about hurting the stealth of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, that's the probably anti-PR answer.
I think it's probably how I've been explaining it.
Good.
Describe it without describing it.
Well, especially here, like it just depends on like what audience you're talking to. Like as I said, like, you should really think like, why am I what is the value of being stealth right now? And usually companies now begin to iterate even on messaging and the way social works and the way media works and the way actually the general customer population works, is most people need to hear things several times before they get it anyway. So it's just very hard to imagine you hurting your story unless you're going to go somewhere huge and like take out a big banner ad somewhere and say, here's what we're all about.
For our word story necessarily have to give away what we do, because we kind of have one that our company says what we do, and I feel like doesn't necessarily that you would know what the company did based on it.
No, and I don't think they do at all. Like, and again, like I think Facebook, like hear from friends, and again, like that's a made-up story that we did and how we applied it to them. But I think that's sort of essentially when you think about it, like that's actually what happens. And that's so I don't think it has to be like the very like functional statement of what we do, but it's a good starting point for the exercise, because I feel like people need to see like, well, what should I say in my forward story? And just from what you heard today, like people begin to take them in very different directions based on that directive. But I'm biased. Like I like the ones that have nothing to do with what people do. Because again, like it's all the same to me. So it's like, oh, that's I want to know the like sort of magic I'm buying into around whatever it is that you do.
So I'm curious if you think, or what's the role of certain mechanics that sometimes work, like the role of detail, the opening kind of hook, the withy, kind of like the mechanics that often are used in tech storytelling. How does that map on top of your?
Well, I think the setting piece is very much like the hook. Like, and it's sort of like that dark, stormy, like it is kind of going to locate you in something that's very specific. I mentioned my backstory. I think when you really delve into character, like anything, when you see reporters really diving deep, they usually go into the backstory of a founder to put more color into the current state of things. And that might not be a piece that's used like in the first, few pieces of launching or coverage, but it's something that you should have because it informs who you are. And then I think, the example I have of the kids, if you read again, I'm thinking now more from a media perspective, like, and this is really hard for young companies, but like people like to have customers in their stories. Like they don't want to have like the actual people you're touching, and they don't just want to talk to another. There are a million tech founders, in the Valley, and they all seem to go to Stanford, and they're all highly pedigreed, and they all everyone just sounds so similar that especially nowadays, and there are fewer and fewer reporters, that no one wants to cover the same thing. And that's why I was just saying, like, we've seen at our firm, like launches, it's hard to get someone to like 20 outlets to cover the same launch. And there needs to be something that makes you more real, and that's why we've gotten into much more iterative storytelling for clients, so that how do you keep telling a narrative over the course of weeks and months and years, because you're not going to have that big pop and there's no outlet that you can write that one story in the New York Times and everybody knows you, or that moment on 60 Minutes. Like those just don't happen because there's not enough eyeballs on those outlets. Did that answer? You're still perplexed, like no. Yeah. He's mad because all right. Anybody else? I know the whole lunch thing was tempting because they're all like, wait, we're going to miss our early lunch break. Well, thank you. Oh, no.
I struggled a bit, by the way, with this one, so you'll please be gentle.
Oh.
And I can tell you where the struggle was after, but your data wants to help. And what we do is effectively, we're trying to create a collaboration technology, but rather than have people always having to enter in and give more explicit inputs, it's something that can basically, if you give it access to your calendar, location, metadata about yourself, it can fill in the blanks and effectively give you an easy button to, let's say, negotiate and figure out who could help you with something, or when somebody else might be available depending upon your preferences and habits, without just saying, I'm available at 3 p.m. And
I think like that, and this is again forward stories, like I think that would actually be like a really good rallying cry for a company. It feels a little bit like not quite with as much bite as like the end of software, but your data wants to help feels like something you could see on marketing collateral. It could be a good log line into a story, and this goes to like how do you get people interested. Like you could sit down like, hey, everyone has data, but they don't realize your data wants to help and it's not helping right now. It kind of becomes like an easy way to tell the narrative, and that's where, and then you could say, let me tell you what's going on. And then you go into the world, and then you can say, let me tell you, so you can actually see now, it just kind of gives you an opening to tell that story. So I like that. See, I wasn't harsh at all.
no.
See? I surprised you, right? You're like, I'm unknown. Great, well, thank you for having me, and hopefully you learned something.